The mountains were quiet that evening, too quiet. Elliot stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, coffee mug warming his old, calloused hands as the wind whispered through the pine trees. A late autumn storm was rolling in. The clouds above the valley brimmed with shadow and tension, and the last rays of sunlight barely pierced the dense fog crawling over the forest floor. He'd lived alone up here for nearly a decade, ever since retiring from the forestry service. The cabin, once a ranger station, had become his sanctuary. Remote. Peaceful. Predictable. Just the way he liked it. Until tonight. It started with a sound. Not the rustle of deer, or the yip of coyotes, or the hoot of distant owls. No, this was heavier. Slower. Dragging. Elliot stepped off the porch instinctively, his eyes scanning the treeline. The sound grew closer. Branches cracked. A low, uneven grunt echoed from the underbrush. Then it emerged. A large bear, nearly full-grown, limping badly, its right front leg slicked with blood. Its fur was matted wet, streaked with mud. It moved like a wounded soldier, slow, deliberate, but determined. And worst of all, it wasn't growling. It wasn't afraid. It was looking directly at him. Elliot froze, not out of fear, but awe. Most wild bears avoided humans. This one didn't. Its breathing was labored. Each step looked painful. And then, with a quiet huff, it collapsed right near the edge of his shed. The forest fell silent again. He should have called the rangers. Or grabbed his rifle. But he didn't. Instead, Elliot knelt cautiously near the edge of the porch, peering through the shadows. He could hear the bear's breath, shallow and shivering. The animal wasn't dying, not yet. But it was close. Wounded and exhausted. If it had meant harm, it would have attacked already. But it hadn't. There was something familiar about its eyes, not the wild fury of a cornered animal, but a quiet awareness. A recognition. As if it remembered him. Elliot's heart skipped. He reached for his flashlight and aimed it toward the bear's body, scanning the injuries. One leg swollen and likely sprained. Deep cuts along its shoulder. A metal glint peeked out near its neck. He moved closer. A torn wildlife tracking collar. The number was barely visible, scratched into the tag, #A81R3. He had seen collars like this before, during his days working with wildlife conservation programs. This wasn't just a wild bear. It was tagged, tracked. Part of a study. And now, it had come here? Why? He whispered aloud, barely able to believe his own words. Do I know you? The bear didn't respond, of course. But it didn't flinch either. Elliot stepped back slowly, opened his shed, and pulled out his emergency first aid kit, the one he hadn't used since that day 5 years ago. He returned, crouched a few feet away, and set the kit down where the bear could see it. I'll help, he murmured, voice rough. But you need to stay still. Just like last time. Last time. He blinked, startled by the thought. Could it really be? Could this be him? The cub he once rescued from a trap and nursed back to life years ago, before letting it disappear into the forest? Before Elliot could process the memory, the bear shifted slightly, not in pain but in calm, and rested its massive head on its paw. Not asleep. Just trusting. Elliot sat down in the dirt beside the bear, heart racing. The past, it seemed, had come back to his door. Bleeding. And carrying a message. 5 years earlier, the forest had looked very different. Spring had just begun to breathe color into the gray mountains. Snowmelt trickled through creeks, and saplings pushed their way out of the thawed ground. Elliot, still working part-time with the Forestry Service back then, had been inspecting trail markers after a harsh winter storm when he heard something strange, sharp, high-pitched squeals echoing through the trees. Not bird calls. Something frightened. Something hurting. He followed the sound. It led him deep into a thicket, where he found the cub. It was small, maybe 3 or 4 months old. Black-furred, trembling, eyes wide with fear. Its front leg was caught in a crude wire snare, cutting deeply into the flesh. Blood had pooled beneath it, and flies buzzed hungrily in the cold spring air. Elliot's stomach churned. Illegal poachers had set traps like this before, despite countless warnings. Most animals didn't survive long after getting caught. But this cub had fought. It had chewed at the roots, clawed at the dirt, and somehow remained alive. "Easy now," Elliot whispered as he approached. The cub growled weakly. But it didn't run. Its eyes locked onto his. And for a moment, Elliot forgot everything: the job, the protocol, even the danger. All he saw was pain. And trust. And something that felt dangerously close to fate. He brought it back to his cabin wrapped in an old flannel coat, heart pounding the entire time. For 2 weeks, he fed it small portions of milk-soaked bread and raw berries. He treated the wound with iodine and wrapped the leg in clean cloth every day. He didn't tell anyone. If the service found out, they would have confiscated the animal immediately and euthanized it due to the injury. There was no room in the budget for wild risks. So Elliot took the risk himself. And slowly, the cub healed. It never roared. Never clawed. Never bit. Instead, it watched him. Every time Elliot walked in, it raised its head. When he spoke, it tilted its ears. When he sat by the fire, the cub curled at the edge of the room near the door, always near the door, as if it knew it didn't belong, but appreciated being allowed to stay. He named it Bran, after the ancient word for black. And when the day came to release it, he didn't need a cage. He simply opened the cabin door and stood aside. Bran looked at him, nose twitching, then stepped outside. No fear. No farewell. Just a look. A pause. And then it was gone. Elliot had told himself he did the right thing. Letting nature take its course. Not interfering too long. But after that, the cabin felt emptier. Even the forest seemed quieter. He kept the coat Bran had been wrapped in, folded in a drawer. A piece of flannel stained faintly with old blood and fur. Just a memory. Just a chapter closed. Until now. Back in the present, Elliot sat across from the full-grown bear he'd found limping into his yard. He had cleaned the wounds, disinfected the leg, and wrapped it just like he used to. And still, the bear hadn't fled. That night, as the fire crackled inside and the bear lay just beyond the porch wrapped in silence, Elliot couldn't sleep. He pulled open the drawer, took out the flannel coat, stepped outside, and gently placed it near the bear. Bran lifted his head, sniffed, and nudged it with his snout. Not a growl. Not a rejection. Just acknowledgement. Elliot sat down beside him in the dirt again, the firelight casting long shadows across both of their faces. 5 years. Hundreds of miles. And somehow, he had come back. But why now? What brought Bran back after all this time, broken, bleeding, and carrying a message Elliot hadn't yet understood? Whatever it wasn't coincidence. And it wasn't over. The days that followed were quiet, but different. Elliot wasn't used to sharing his space. The forest had always been his alone. The groan of old floorboards, the hiss of a stovetop kettle, the occasional visitor from town bringing supplies. Solitude was his rhythm. But now, the rhythm included heavy paw prints in the snow. Each morning, he'd step outside to find Bran lying at the edge of the porch, his eyes alert but calm. The bear didn't beg for food or growl when Elliot approached. He simply waited. Observed. There was no fear in him, just patience. Elliot began leaving scraps again. Not too close, he wasn't trying to tame the bear. But the message was clear: you are safe here. Bran ate, rested, and recovered in the small clearing like it was a sanctuary. Elliot watched him from the porch, sometimes speaking aloud, as if to fill the silence they both understood too well. "You remember this place, don't you?" he'd murmur, nursing his coffee. "You remember me." And Bran would lift his head just slightly, a slow blink answering more than words could. Underscore 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 underscore. As the snow softened and green returned to the valley, so did the memories. Elliot found himself doing small things without thinking, pulling berries from his own stores and leaving them on the tree stump, as he had when Bran was a cub. Chopping wood closer to the shed, so the sound wouldn't disturb the bear. Even humming an old tune at dusk, one he used to hum by the fireplace when he thought the cub was sleeping in the corner. Bran, though grown massive now, still acted like he remembered it all. He would wait by the same tree every evening. Sometimes, he'd bring something odd with him, a feather, a rock, once even the jawbone of a deer. He'd place it quietly on the stump and back away, watching Elliot's reaction. It was more than habit. It was ritual. Like a conversation without words. One morning, Elliot noticed something new. Bran wasn't limping anymore. The wounds had mostly healed. The fur had begun to regrow around the old scars. His strength had returned. And yet, he didn't leave. Elliot felt the weight of that every day. The clock was ticking. Nature would call Bran back, eventually. He couldn't stay here forever. But until then, they had this. Sometimes Elliot would sit in the clearing, letting the breeze stir the pine needles while Bran lay nearby like a sentinel. Not a pet. Not a prisoner. But a presence. Solid. Still. Familiar. "I never had a family," Elliot said one night, speaking to the fire more than to the bear. "Not really. But maybe I was meant to find you instead." Bran didn't react. But he didn't leave either. Then, something strange happened. Bran began acting differently. Not aggressive. Just alert. He'd wander the edges of the clearing more frequently, nose to the wind, ears twitching. He didn't rest as much. He became restless. Watchful. One night, Elliot followed him as far as the tree-line. Bran turned to look back, not to warn him but to wait. As if saying, "Come. There's something you need to see." But Elliot didn't go. Not yet. He wasn't ready. The next morning, Bran returned with something clenched gently in his jaws, a small rusted piece of metal, circular, dented, and unfamiliar. Elliot took it from him slowly. It wasn't trash. It was another tracking tag. Older. Bent at the edges. No collar. Just a code carved deep into its back. D5K14. A different bear. A different past. Elliot's brow furrowed. Why would Bran bring him this? Where had he found it? And what did it mean? The pieces of the puzzle were forming, but the picture was still unclear. And Elliot's unease was growing. Bran wasn't just staying for comfort. He was staying for a reason. It happened without warning. No trail of pawprints. No final glance. Just silence. For weeks, Bran had returned each morning without fail, a living memory sitting beneath the pine trees like a guardian from another life. And then one morning, he was simply gone. Elliot stood on the porch with his usual coffee, scanning the clearing. Nothing. No shadow between the trees. No movement near the stump. Not even a disturbed patch of snow or a warm imprint in the grass. The flannel coat, which Bran often nudged or lay beside, remained untouched, slowly gathering dust and pine needles. "Bran," he called out, hesitant and unsure why. Bran. The name echoed off the trees and vanished into wind. No answer. The forest was still. Uneasy. At first, Elliot told himself not to panic. Bears come and go. Perhaps Bran had healed enough to return to the wild fully. That had always been the goal, right? But something about the disappearance gnawed at him. There was no warning. No signs of struggle. No obvious trail. It was as if the bear had vanished into thin air, like smoke dissipating between branches. By the third day, Elliot had begun walking the perimeter of the clearing. He checked the nearby thickets, the stream where Bran sometimes drank, even the old tree where he'd found the tracking tag. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a print. Even the birds seemed quieter now. That night, Elliot sat beside the cold fire pit, staring into the dark. He held the rusted tracking tag in his hand, the one Bran had brought days earlier. D5K14. He still hadn't figured out what it meant. But now, holding it in the growing chill, it felt heavier. Ominous. Was it a warning? A sign? Or a goodbye? His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone taken Bran? Had he been lured into another trap like the one from his youth? Was he injured again, or worse? He thought about the scarred collar around Bran's neck. The one from the original wildlife program. Then he thought of the second tag. 2 animals. 2 histories. 1 connection. Elliot didn't sleep that night. The next morning, as snow began to fall lightly from a pale sky, Elliot packed a small bag, medical supplies, food, flares, and a flashlight. He strapped on his boots, slung his old Rangerfield journal over his shoulder, and headed into the woods. He didn't have a trail to follow. Just a feeling. And the silence Bran had left behind. The forest was colder than usual. Elliot pushed through thick undergrowth, guided only by instinct and faint impressions in the snow, the kind of subtle signs only a man like him could see. A broken fern here. A claw-marked tree there. Not a full trail, but a ghost of one. The only real lead he had was the rusted tag, D5K14. That code gnawed at him. After nearly 2 days of searching, camping under a tarp, eating from tins, listening for growls or movement, Elliot decided to hike downhill into the ranger station in Pine Hollow, the closest base with a wildlife database. He hadn't been there in years, but old connections still remembered him. He showed the tag to a junior ranger behind the desk. D5K14, Elliot said. Run it through the National Wildlife Tracking Logs. It's old, but it was active once. The young ranger tapped away, squinting at the screen. Give me a second. Whoa. That's from a discontinued study. Mountain bears. The D5 series was from the Deep Canyon Release Project. Highly controversial. It got shut down about 4 years ago. Why? Elliot asked, his voice tightening. There were reports of bears being reintroduced too aggressively. Survivors ended up injured, and one entire tagged group disappeared after the signal went dead. Some believed poachers found the tags. Others think the terrain was just too brutal. Elliot leaned forward. What about K14? The ranger paused. Hold on, that one had a note attached. He turned the monitor slightly toward Elliot and read aloud. Presumed dead. Final ping recorded near Broken Ridge. Last known companion, tag A81R3. Elliot's breath caught. A81R3. That was Bran. The rest of the search became a mission. Bran hadn't just returned by chance. He had brought the tag of a fallen companion, one likely killed in a failed experiment. Maybe he had witnessed it. Maybe he had carried the memory ever since. And now, Bran was gone again, possibly to the same place. Elliot headed toward Broken Ridge. The trail was steep and half-frozen. Most wouldn't have dared it alone. But Elliot knew these mountains like he knew his own skin. He hiked carefully, eyes scanning for dark shapes against white snow. On the third morning, he found something. A clearing. Abandoned. At the center, a rusted cage barely hidden under pine branches and snow. Inside were bones. Scattered. Picked clean. And nearby, more tags. Bent. Burnt. This had been a poaching ground. Old, but not forgotten. And beside the cage, half buried in frost, was a small pile of things. Stones arranged in a circle. A strip of faded flannel. And a clump of black fur. Elliot sank to his knees. It was a memorial. Not made by man. But by a bear. Bran had returned to this place not just to mourn, but to remember. To honor. To show Elliot the truth about what had happened to others like him. This was the message. Not one of revenge. But of trust. And grief. And something like forgiveness. Elliot stood there for a long time. He picked up the flannel, his own from years ago, and clutched it tightly. I see you now, he whispered to the wind. I understand. Elliot returned to the cabin in silence. The cold air bit at his face, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were far away, trapped somewhere between past and present, between the cub he once saved, and the giant who had returned with a message only a heart could translate. 4 days, the clearing remained empty. The coat on the porch stayed untouched. The firewood stack sat unburned. The forest, always humming with distant life, felt hollow. He spent his time journaling everything, the broken tracking tags, the memorial site, the GPS code records, and the bones in the snow. It was all written down in quiet detail, as if someone someday might need to know what really happened to the bears that were forgotten. Then one snowy evening, just as the sky began to bleed gold over the ridgeline, Elliot heard a sound he hadn't realized he'd been longing for. A heavy shuffle. A familiar breath. The crunch of snow. He turned slowly toward the edge of the forest. There, just between the trees, stood Bran. But he wasn't alone. At his side was a smaller bear, perhaps just past its cubhood. Lighter in fur, thinner, and hesitant in step. A youngling. Its eyes flicked nervously between Bran and Elliot. Elliot's breath caught. A new generation. A life protected. Had Bran become a father? Or perhaps, a guardian? Bran moved forward slowly, his eyes locked onto Elliot's like they had so many times before. The younger bear stayed behind, but didn't flee. Bran stepped onto the porch, not aggressively, not demanding. Just present. Elliot, heart-pounding, opened the cabin door wide. "You found your way back," he whispered. Again. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to touch. He simply stood in the doorway, one man and one bear, facing each other like old friends on the final page of a long unfinished story. Then Bran did something unexpected. He turned his head, opened his jaws, and gently dropped something at Elliot's feet. It was a worn, knotted piece of wood, small, smoothed by water and time. Attached to it was a single metal tag. D5K14. The same one as before. But this time, it had been cleaned. Polished. Made into something sacred. A keepsake. A memory. A tribute. Elliot knelt down and picked it up. His hands trembled. His voice cracked. "Thank you, Bran." As night fell, Elliot didn't close the door. He lit the fireplace and sat in the rocking chair, letting the warmth reach the doorway, letting the glow spill onto the porch like a welcome mat. Bran didn't enter. He didn't need to. He simply lay down outside, resting once more in the safety of the clearing. The young bear mirrored him on the outer edge of the trees. The legacy had returned. Not just to say goodbye, but to pass something on. A bond. A memory. A quiet message: you mattered. In the days that followed, Elliot carved a new marker beside the cabin, out of pine wood, simple and strong. He etched the words by hand. Some stories are remembered by people. Others are carried through the wild. Bran came and went, less frequently now. But whenever the snow fell deep and the wind howled loud, Elliot would still look to the trees listening. And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd catch the outline of a bear, watching from the shadows, reminding him. The forest remembers.